The Velthari Empire had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. They had conquered over 2,000 worlds across 3 spiral arms of the Milky Way. Every species they met had fallen before their armies. Every planet they wanted became theirs. This was simply how things worked. The strong took from the weak. The Velthari were the strongest beings in the known universe, and they knew it. Their method was simple, and it always worked. First, they would send scout ships to study a new world. These scouts would watch and learn. They would find where the enemy kept their soldiers. They would map every military base, every weapons factory, every ship and tank and gun. Then the war fleet would arrive. The fleet would destroy everything military from orbit. After that, ground troops would land and take control of the scared civilians who remained. It was clean, it was fast, it never failed. Admiral Zareth had commanded 47 successful conquests in his long career. He was old for a Velthari, nearly 300 years, but his mind was still sharp and his reputation was perfect. When the scout ships returned with information about a small blue planet called Earth, he reviewed their reports with the casual interest of a professional who had done this many times before. The planet was pleasant enough. It had water and good air and rich soil. The dominant species called themselves humans. They were soft creatures, made of fragile flesh and thin bones. They lived short lives of less than 100 years. They had spread across their world and built cities and machines, but they were primitive by Velthari standards. Their fastest ships could barely reach their own moon. They had no shields, no energy weapons, no faster-than-light travel. Most importantly, their military was small and obvious. The scouts had mapped everything. The humans kept their soldiers in clearly marked bases with flags and fences. Their warships floated on the water with numbers painted on their sides. Their flying machines sat in neat rows at airfields. Their armies wore matching clothes so everyone could see who was a soldier and who was not. It was almost cute, Zareth thought, how organized they were about it. The numbers were not impressive. The humans had perhaps 20 million active soldiers across their entire world. Their population was 8 billion. This meant that less than 1% of humans were warriors. The rest were civilians, workers, and families. They were not a threat. Zareth brought his findings to the War Council. The old admirals and generals looked at the pictures and the numbers, and they agreed with his assessment. Earth would be an easy conquest. 3 days to destroy their military from orbit. Another week to establish control on the ground. Perhaps a month of cleanup operations. Then the planet would belong to the Empire, and its 8 billion humans would serve Velthari interests. The Council approved the invasion. Zareth assembled the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. 400 warships made the journey to the Sol system. It was more than enough. It was probably too many, but Zareth believed in being thorough. The fleet arrived in orbit around Earth on a Tuesday morning. Though, of course, the Velthari did not use human calendars. The humans saw them coming. Their primitive sensors detected the ships when they were still far away. Zareth allowed this. He wanted them to know what was coming. Fear made conquest easier. The humans sent radio messages. They asked questions. They demanded explanations. They made threats. Zareth ignored all of it. He had heard such things before from 100 different species. The words were always different, but the meaning was the same. Please do not hurt us. We will fight you. You cannot do this. We are not afraid. They were always afraid. And they were always conquered anyway. The bombardment began at dawn over the American continent. Zareth chose this location because it held the largest concentration of human military power. Energy beams fell from the sky like rain. Military bases vanished in flashes of light. Naval fleets that had taken decades to build were boiled away in seconds. Air bases and their hundreds of aircraft became craters of melted metal and ash. The humans tried to fight back. They launched missiles at the Velthari ships. The missiles were slow and stupid, and the ship shields stopped them easily. They sent their remaining aircraft to attack. The aircraft were shot down before they could get close. They fired their land-based weapons at the fleet. None of it mattered. The Velthari had fought 1,000 battles against 1,000 enemies. Human weapons were like toys compared to what they had faced before. Within 12 hours, every military installation on Earth had been destroyed. Xyreth reviewed the damage reports with satisfaction. The human military had effectively ceased to exist. Their bases were gone. Their ships were sunk. Their aircraft were scrap. Their armies were scattered and leaderless. The planet was now defenseless. Xyreth transmitted the standard surrender demand. It was translated into the major human languages and broadcast across all their communication frequencies. The message was simple. The humans had lost. Resistance was over. They would now submit to Velthari rule. Those who cooperated would be treated fairly. Those who did not would be destroyed. They had 24 hours to respond. He expected surrender within hours. That was how it always worked. Once a species understood they had no chance of winning, they gave up. It was logical. It was sensible. It was what every other species had done. The ground invasion began 3 days after the orbital bombardment. Xyreth had given the humans time to accept their defeat. None of their governments had officially surrendered, but that did not worry him. Sometimes species needed to see boots on the ground before they truly understood. He had seen it before. Pride made creatures stubborn until reality crushed that pride into dust. The Velthari had tools that made conquest easier. Their psionic scanners could detect combat training in any creature's mind. Warriors thought differently than civilians. They had sharper instincts, faster reactions, more aggressive mental patterns. The scanners could identify these traits from a great distance. This allowed the Velthari to know exactly who was dangerous and who was not. The scanners showed that the human population was almost entirely harmless. The readings were clear: 8 billion creatures with passive, non-threatening mental signatures. Only scattered individuals showed combat training, presumably the survivors of the destroyed military. These individuals could be found and eliminated easily. Commander Keth led the 1st Battalion to land on Earth's surface. His target was a small town in a region called Kentucky. It was a nothing place, home to about 8,000 humans. The plan was simple: secure the town, establish a base, then advance toward larger population centers. His soldiers were eager. They had trained their whole lives for conquest, and this would be an easy victory to add to their records. The dropships landed in the fields outside the town just after sunrise. Keth assembled his troops and began the march toward the buildings. His scanners showed him exactly what he expected: thousands of humans with no combat training, frightened civilians who would submit or flee. A few might resist with primitive weapons, but they would be crushed quickly. The first shot came from a small wooden structure on a hill. The Velthari soldier walking beside Keth fell dead with a hole through his helmet. The sound of the shot reached them a moment later, a sharp crack that echoed across the fields. Keth ordered his troops to find cover and locate the shooter. Before they could move, 3 more soldiers fell. The shots came from different directions now: someone in a house, someone behind a fence, someone in a tree line. His soldiers were being killed, and they could not see who was killing them. The shooter on the hill was eventually spotted. Keth sent a squad to eliminate her. He assumed it was a surviving soldier, perhaps someone who had escaped the destruction of a nearby base. When his troops reached the structure, they found an old woman. She was 73 years old, small and gray-haired, wearing simple clothes. Her name was Dorothy Price. She had killed 9 Velthari warriors with a hunting rifle before they reached her. She did not surrender. She fought until they killed her. And as she died, she was smiling. Keth did not understand. His scanners had shown nothing. This woman had no military training in her mind. She was a civilian, a grandmother, a person who had spent her life growing vegetables and baking bread. Yet she had killed 9 of his soldiers with the calm skill of a trained sniper. The situation in the town was worse. The humans did not run. They did not surrender. They fought from every building, every window, every corner. A male named Chris Hartley organized the defense using communication devices called ham radios. He was a plumber by trade. He fixed pipes and toilets for a living. He had never served in any military, yet he coordinated the town's resistance like a general commanding an army. A group of young humans from something called the Volunteer Fire Department built explosive devices from farm chemicals. They destroyed an entire Velthari armor column with homemade bombs. They had learned how to make these weapons from something called the Internet, a human information network. None of them had combat training. None of them were soldiers. They were just people who had decided to fight. Keth's battalion was destroyed in 6 hours. Not defeated. Destroyed. 900 Velthari soldiers killed by farmers and shopkeepers and schoolchildren. Keth himself was shot by a 14-year-old boy who then ran away into the woods and was never found. Reports began arriving from across the planet, and every report told the same impossible story. In Texas, a single human male held off an entire Velthari platoon for 19 hours. His name was Sam Butler. He was 61 years old and raised cattle for a living. He had an enormous collection of personal weapons and enough ammunition to fight a small war. When asked later why he had so many guns, he simply said he liked them. He killed 47 Velthari soldiers before they finally brought him down with an orbital strike. They had to destroy his entire ranch from space to stop one old man. In Alaska, a female named Megan Dawson led a guerrilla force through the mountains. She was a school teacher. She taught mathematics to children. She had never served in any military. Yet she commanded 40 civilians in a campaign that killed over 2 months into the invasion. Admiral Zyreth made a decision that had never been necessary before. He called for the Empire's scholars. Scientists and researchers were brought from the core worlds, experts in biology and psychology and the study of alien minds. Their mission was simple: figure out what was wrong with the humans. Dr. Veth was the leader of this research team. She was the Empire's greatest expert on alien psychology. She had studied over 300 species during her career. She had written the textbooks that young Velthari officers used to understand their enemies. If anyone could solve the puzzle of humanity, it was her. She began by reviewing everything the Empire knew about Earth. She watched recordings of the battles. She studied the humans who had been captured. She analyzed their biology, their brain structure, their social patterns. She spent weeks gathering information before she felt ready to make her report. When she finally presented her findings to Admiral Zyreth, she did not look confident. She looked disturbed. The problem, she explained, was that the Velthari had made a fundamental mistake. They had assumed humans were like every other species they had conquered. They were not. They were something entirely different, something the Empire had never encountered before. Every other species in the galaxy had evolved to specialize. Some species were warriors by nature, built for combat from birth. Others were peaceful, with violence bred out of them over millions of years. The Velthari scanners worked by detecting these differences. A warrior's mind looked different from a civilian's mind because they were fundamentally different creatures. Humans did not specialize. Every human was born with the full capacity for violence. Every single one. The grandmother who baked bread could also kill without hesitation. The teacher who educated children could also lead soldiers into battle. The farmer who grew food could also destroy armored vehicles with homemade explosives. These were not different types of humans. They were all the same type. They were all dangerous. But here was the part that Dr. Veth found most disturbing. The humans knew this about themselves. They had always known. And they had spent their entire history learning to control it. Human children were taught from birth to suppress their violent instincts. They learned to share instead of fight. They learned to talk instead of kill. They learned to follow rules that prevented them from hurting each other. Their entire civilization was built around containing the monster that lived inside every single one of them. They had created elaborate systems for this purpose. They had laws and police to punish violence. They had sports and games that let them compete without killing. They had entertainment that satisfied their need for conflict through stories and simulations. They had built a society where most humans could live their entire lives without ever releasing what they truly were. But it was always there, waiting, controlled but never destroyed. When the Veltari attacked, they did not face a species that needed to become violent. They faced a species that had been holding back their violence for their entire existence. The attack did not create human warriors. It simply gave the existing warriors permission to stop pretending. Dr. Veth explained this with examples that made Zereth uncomfortable. The hunters. Earth had millions of humans who killed animals for sport. Not for food, though they ate what they killed. For pleasure. They enjoyed tracking and shooting living creatures. They practiced these skills constantly, passing them down through generations. They were trained snipers who had never worn a uniform, the martial artists. Millions more humans practiced combat as a hobby. They learned to fight with their hands and feet and ancient weapons. They trained their bodies and minds for battle. They did this for fun, for exercise, for spiritual reasons. They were hand-to-hand combat experts who worked in offices and shops. The gun collectors. In some human nations, civilians owned more weapons than the military. They bought guns and rifles and ammunition in enormous quantities. They practiced shooting at ranges built specifically for this purpose. They studied ballistics and tactics and military history. They were armed infantry who had never served a day in uniform, the preppers. Some humans spent their lives preparing for disaster. They built shelters and stored food and water. They learned survival skills and medical techniques. They planned for wars and plagues and the collapse of civilization. They had been waiting for exactly this situation for decades. And then there were the veterans, humans who had served in their official military and then returned to civilian life. These numbered in the tens of millions. They had actual combat training, real warfare experience. They had fought in human wars all over their planet. And when they finished their service, they simply went home and became teachers and plumbers and farmers. They looked exactly like everyone else. They were invisible until they chose not to be. Dr. Veth's conclusion was simple and terrifying. 6 months after the invasion began, Admiral Zyreth held a war council meeting that would have been unthinkable on any previous conquest. He was there to discuss failure. The numbers told the story clearly. The Velthari had lost 63,000 soldiers on Earth's surface. They had killed perhaps 10 times that many humans, maybe more. But it did not matter. For every human who fell, 3 more appeared to take their place. They came from nowhere, from everywhere, from the general population that the scanners still showed as harmless. The Velthari were not fighting an army. They were fighting a planet. Ground control was impossible. Every base the Velthari established was attacked within hours. Every patrol was ambushed. Every supply line was cut. The humans fought from forests and mountains and cities. They fought from sewers and basements and rooftops. They fought with captured Velthari weapons that they learned to use with disturbing speed. They fought with homemade explosives and hunting rifles and kitchen knives. They never stopped fighting. The Velthari still controlled the sky. Their ships circled Earth with enough firepower to glass the entire surface, but orbital bombardment could not win this war. Every time they destroyed a city, the survivors scattered into the countryside and continued fighting. Every time they bombed a forest, the humans just moved to a different forest. The planet was too big and the humans were too many. Zyreth needed a victory, a real victory, something that would break the human will to resist. He chose a city called Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was an old human city built around rivers and steel. It had been an industrial center once, a place where humans made the metal for their machines. It was not the largest city or the most important city, but it was defended and defiant. Taking it would send a message. The Empire could still conquer. The Empire would still win. Xyreth committed 15,000 soldiers to the assault. It was the largest ground operation of the entire invasion. Dropships darkened the sky as they descended on the city. Tanks and walkers rolled through the streets. Air support circled overhead, ready to strike anything that moved. The humans were waiting for them. The defense of Pittsburgh was organized by a man named Daniel Torres. He was 54 years old. For most of his life, he had worked at a steel mill, the same kind of work his father and grandfather had done before him. 30 years ago, he had served in something called the Marine Corps, one of the human military organizations. He had fought in human wars in places called Iraq and Afghanistan. Then he had come home and gone back to making steel. When the Velthari invaded, Daniel Torres did not run. He did not hide. He did not wait for someone else to do something. He walked into the local union hall and started organizing. The union was a human organization for workers. They negotiated for better pay and safer conditions. They looked after each other. They had a long history of fighting for what they believed in. Torres used this structure to build an army. Steel workers and truck drivers and electricians, teachers and nurses and store clerks, veterans and civilians and teenagers barely old enough to hold a gun. Anyone who could fight, anyone who would fight, was welcome. By the time the Velthari arrived, Torres had nearly 40,000 people under his command. They were not soldiers in any official sense. They had no uniforms, no ranks, no military structure. They were just people who had decided that this was their city and they were not going to give it up. The Battle of Pittsburgh lasted 18 days. The Velthari advanced block by block, building by building. Every step cost them lives. The humans had turned the city into a fortress. They had dug tunnels and built barricades. They had booby-trapped buildings and mined roads. They had snipers on rooftops and ambush teams in basements. They knew every street and alley, every sewer and crawl space. Torres led from the front. He was everywhere during the battle, appearing at critical moments to rally defenders or plug gaps in the line. He seemed to need no sleep, no rest, no food. He moved through the city like a ghost, always where the fighting was worst. His people loved him and followed him without question. The Velthari brought their full power to bear. They called in orbital strikes that leveled entire neighborhoods. They deployed their heaviest weapons and their most elite troops. They fought with all the skill and technology that had conquered 2,000 worlds. It was not enough. On the 12th day, a Velthari general named Krath led an assault on a bridge that Torres was defending. Krath was a decorated officer with 100 victories to his name. He had personally killed thousands of enemies in his career. He led his soldiers across the bridge with complete confidence. Torres was waiting with 30 volunteers and a pile of captured Velthari explosives. The battle on the bridge lasted 4 hours. Krath threw wave after wave of soldiers at the human position. Torres and his people held their ground. When they ran out of ammunition, they fought with knives and clubs and bare hands. When the Velthari finally reached them, Torres detonated the explosives. The bridge collapsed into the river. Krath and 200 of his soldiers died. Torres and all 30 of his volunteers died with them. But the Velthari advance was stopped for 3 more days while they found another way across the water. The city finally fell on the 18th day. The Velthari took Pittsburgh, or what was left of it, but the War Council of the Velthari Empire met in the Great Chamber on their homeworld. It was a room that had seen 10,000 years of victory. Every wall was decorated with trophies from conquered worlds. Every seat was filled with admirals and generals who had never known defeat. They had gathered to discuss something that had never happened before. They had gathered to discuss retreat. Admiral Xyreth presented his report in person. He stood before the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy and told them the truth. The invasion of Earth had failed. Not partially failed, not temporarily failed. Completely and permanently failed. He explained the numbers. 63,000 Velthari soldiers dead. Over 1,000 vehicles and aircraft destroyed. 12 warships damaged by human attacks, including 3 that had been hit by nuclear weapons launched from hidden locations. The humans had lost far more, perhaps 1 million dead, but their population remained enormous. Their will to fight showed no sign of breaking. He explained the situation on the ground. The Velthari controlled nothing on Earth's surface. Every base had been abandoned or destroyed. Every attempt to establish permanent positions had failed. The humans attacked day and night, without rest, without mercy. They used weapons captured from Velthari dead. They used weapons built in hidden factories. They used weapons that should not have been possible for such a primitive species. He explained the research findings. The humans were not like other species. They could not be conquered through traditional methods. Their civilians were their military. Every man, woman, and child was a potential warrior. They had been hiding this truth not through deception, but through their own nature. They chose to be peaceful, but they were not peaceful. They never had been. The council listened in silence. When Xyrith finished, the questions began. Could they not simply destroy the planet from orbit? One council member suggested. Burn the surface clean and take the resources afterward. Xyrith had considered this. He had rejected it. Earth was rich in minerals and water and biological diversity. Destroying it would waste all of that value. But more importantly, the humans had spread. They had colonies on their moon. They had settlements on a planet called Mars. They had stations floating in space and missions traveling through their solar system. Destroying Earth would not destroy humanity. It would only ensure that they survived angry and vengeful and determined to strike back. Could they not simply blockade the system, trap the humans on their world, and wait for them to exhaust themselves? Xyrith had considered this too. The problem was time. Human scientists were already studying captured Velthari technology. They were learning how it worked. They were finding ways to copy it and improve it. Their progress was shockingly fast. Within a generation, perhaps less, they would have faster-than-light travel. They would break any blockade. They would find their way to Velthari space. And they would remember what the Empire had done to them. The council debated for 3 days. They argued and threatened and demanded solutions that did not exist. They were the rulers of 2,000 worlds, the commanders of the greatest military force in galactic history. They did not know how to accept defeat. They had never had to learn. In the end, they had no choice. Admiral Xyrith was authorized to withdraw the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet from the Sol system. The retreat would be presented as a strategic redeployment, not a defeat. The official records would show that Earth had been deemed not worth the cost of full conquest. The truth would be classified at the highest levels, known only to the Council and a few trusted advisors. The fleet left Earth 14 months after arriving. The ships rose from their orbits and turned toward home. On the surface below, humans watched them go. Some cheered, some wept. Some simply stood in silence, not quite believing that it was over. It was over. But Xyrith knew it was not truly finished. Before he left, he added one final entry to the official record. It was a recommendation that became policy within days of the fleet's return. The Sol system was declared a quarantine zone. No Velthari ship would enter it. No Velthari citizen would travel there. Contact with humans was forbidden under penalty of death. The quarantine was not presented as fear. It was presented as caution, as wisdom, as a practical decision to avoid unnecessary conflict. But Xyrith knew the truth, and in his private log he wrote it down for anyone who might someday need to understand. We assumed that identifying their military meant identifying their warriors. We were wrong. Every human is a warrior. They have simply chosen, for their own internal reasons, to pretend otherwise. They maintain the fiction of civilians because it suits them, because it allows them to build and create and live in peace with each other. But the moment that peace is threatened, the fiction vanishes. Their most dangerous soldiers are not hidden among the civilians. Their civilians are the soldiers, every last one of them. And they are more dangerous than anything we have ever encountered because they spend their entire lives learning to control what they are capable of, waiting for permission to stop. We did not lose to the human military. We lost to humanity itself. We lost to teachers and farmers and old women with hunting rifles. We lost to plumbers who could coordinate battles and steel workers who could hold bridges against our best troops. We lost to a species that treats violence as a personal choice rather than a biological category. Do not go back. Do not provoke them. Do not remind them that we exist. Let them spread through their own corner of the galaxy and hope that they forget about us. Because if they decide to remember, if they decide to come looking for revenge, we will not be able to stop them. Nothing will be able to stop them. The quarantine remains in effect to this day. Earth rebuilt slowly after the war. The cities that had been destroyed were constructed again. The people who had died were mourned and remembered. Life returned to normal, or something close to it. Humans went back to their jobs and their families and their ordinary lives. They put away their weapons and their anger. They became civilians again because they chose to be civilians. But they did not forget. In Montana, a man named Jake Collins still lives on his family ranch. He is old now, his hair gray, and his face lined with age. Every morning he sits on his porch with a cup of coffee and watches the sky. His neighbors think he is just enjoying the view. They do not know that he is watching for ships. He was the first to warn the Veltari. He sent that message not as a threat but as a courtesy. He wanted them to understand what they were walking into. He wanted to give them a chance to turn back. They did not listen. They had to learn the hard way. Now he waits. He does not expect the Empire to return. The quarantine has held for decades. But Jake Collins knows something that the Velthari are only beginning to understand. Humans do not just defend. Eventually they explore. Eventually they expand. Eventually they go looking for the things that threaten them, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. They will want to know who the Velthari are. They will want to see the Empire's worlds. They will want to meet the species that tried to conquer them. And when that day comes, Jake Collins hopes he is still alive to see it. Not because he wants revenge. Not because he wants war. But because he wants to be there when the Velthari finally understand the full truth about humanity. They are not just warriors hiding as civilians. They are the most adaptable, persistent, creative, and stubborn species the galaxy has ever produced. They survived ice ages and plagues and disasters that would have ended any other civilization. They fought each other for thousands of years and somehow did not destroy themselves. They reached their moon and their neighboring planets and the edges of their solar system not because they had to, but because they wanted to see what was there. Now they know the galaxy is larger than they imagined. Now they know there are other species out there, species that will try to conquer them and enslave them and destroy them. And now they have a reason to keep going. Jake Collins sips his coffee and smiles at the empty sky. The Empire should have listened when they had the chance. They should have turned around and gone home and left Earth alone. But they did not. And now, humanity knows they are not alone in the universe. The Velthari made a terrible mistake. They woke something up. End Ictory was hollow. They had lost 12,000 soldiers, nearly 80% of the assault force. They had killed perhaps 30,000 humans. But most of the defenders had not died. They had retreated. They had melted back into the surrounding countryside, into the hills and forests and small towns. They took their weapons with them. They took their knowledge of Velthari tactics. They took their anger and their hatred and their determination to keep fighting. Torres was dead, but his example lived on. Within weeks, every major human city had its own version of the Pittsburgh defense. Workers and teachers and ordinary people organizing themselves for war. The humans had learned that they could hurt the Empire. They had learned that they could make the conquerors bleed. Admiral Xyrith reviewed the battle reports in his command chamber. 12,000 soldiers lost to take one city, and there were hundreds of cities on Earth, thousands of towns, millions of places where humans could hide and fight and die, and be replaced by more humans who were just as dangerous. The math was clear. The Velthari could not win this war. Not with the forces they had. Not with the forces they could bring. Not with any number of soldiers or ships or weapons. For the first time in 10,000 years of conquest, the Velthari Empire had met an enemy they could not defeat. The Velthari scanners had not failed. They had worked perfectly. They showed that human civilians had no combat training, because human civilians did not need combat training. The violence was already there, built into their biology, hardened by millions of years of evolution. Humans did not learn to be dangerous. They learned to hide how dangerous they were. They learned to be safe enough to live together without killing each other every day. The Velthari had not invaded a planet of civilians defended by a small military. They had invaded a planet of 8 billion warriors who had been pretending to be civilians. The military was just the tip of the iceberg, the humans who had chosen to be openly dangerous. Beneath the surface was everyone else. Every grandmother and teacher and child, all of them carrying the same capacity for destruction. Xyrith listened to this report in silence. When Dr. Veth finished, he asked one question. How do we defeat them? Dr. Veth did not have an answer. She did not think there was one. The Empire had never faced an enemy like this. Their entire military doctrine was built on identifying and destroying enemy warriors while controlling enemy civilians. That doctrine was meaningless against humans because there was no difference between the two. Xyrith dismissed her and sat alone in his command chamber for a long time. Outside his window, Earth turned slowly in the darkness of space. It looked peaceful from orbit. Blue and green and white, covered in clouds and water. A beautiful world full of beautiful creatures. Creatures that were far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. 200 Velthari soldiers in 3 weeks. Her tactics were so effective that the Empire later studied them at their war academies. In Japan, a group of elderly humans defended their village using ancient swords. They had practiced something called martial arts their entire lives, treating combat as a form of meditation and art. They killed 30 Velthari soldiers in close combat before being overwhelmed. In Switzerland, a nation that had not fought a war in hundreds of years, the entire population seemed to be armed and trained. The Velthari could not establish a single base there. Every attempt was ambushed. Every patrol was destroyed. The humans knew the mountains better than any scanner could map them. Xyrith stared at the casualty reports in disbelief. He had expected losses. Ground invasions always had losses. But these numbers made no sense. His soldiers were dying by the thousands, and they were being killed by people who should not know how to fight. Teachers and farmers and old women, children and shopkeepers and office workers, people whose minds showed no combat training at all. He called for his science officers. He demanded explanations. The psionic scanners had worked perfectly on every other species. They had never failed before. How could they be wrong now? The answer would take time to discover, and by the time Xyrith understood what he was facing, it would be far too late. The humans had been hiding something from the Empire. Not intentionally, but by their very nature. They were not like other species. They had never been like other species. And the Velthari were about to learn exactly how different they were. Instead, Xyrith received a different kind of message. It came from a region called Montana, a rural area with mountains and forests and very few people. The sender identified himself as Jake Collins. He was not a government leader or a military commander. He was just a man sitting on the porch of a wooden house, holding a cup of something hot. The message was short. "You just made a terrible mistake," Jake Collins said. He smiled when he said it. Then the transmission ended. Zyreth watched the message 3 times. His advisors told him it was nothing. Just a scared human trying to sound brave. The words of a defeated creature who could not accept reality. They recommended ignoring it and proceeding with the ground invasion. Zyreth agreed. The message meant nothing. Humans were soft and primitive, and their military was gone. The conquest would proceed as planned. He would later realize that Jake Collins had been trying to warn him, not threatening, warning. There was a difference, and Zyreth had not understood it. He was about to learn.